Captain Margot Hayes' spacecraft groaned as it tore through the atmosphere of the uncharted moon. A violent storm battered the hull, sending sharp tremors through the metal, and the lights flickered in response. Margot's breath came in short bursts as she gripped the console, trying to steady herself. The control panel beeped frantically as warning lights flared up, signaling critical damage. Her ship was in free fall, and she knew it wasn't going to end well. Her heart pounded in her chest as she frantically pressed buttons to regain control. She could feel the pull of gravity getting stronger, dragging her toward the jagged surface of the moon below. A hiss of metal and a sudden jolt signaled the worst. The ship had lost power, and she was plummeting. "Come on! Come on!" Margot muttered through clenched teeth, trying to maintain composure. She was a seasoned astronaut, trained for every disaster imaginable, but this was something else. A storm on a dead moon, a place no one had ever charted, and a malfunctioning ship that would soon be her tomb. There was a sudden burst of light through the cockpit window, a brief flash as the ship broke through the storm clouds. Margot held her breath as she steered the vessel toward the rocky surface, but it was no use. The final crash was imminent. Her hands flew across the panel as she braced for impact, a prayer on her lips. The ship's landing gear hit the ground with a bone-shaking thud, sending Margot's body slamming against her seat. Everything went black. When Margot came to, her head throbbed painfully, and her vision was blurred. She groaned and instinctively reached for her helmet's control panel. A few soft taps were enough to release the visor, and she blinked rapidly, trying to regain her bearings. The lights inside the cockpit had all gone out, leaving only the faint glow of the emergency lights to illuminate the wreckage. The moon's surface outside was eerily silent. No signs of life, just a barren wasteland of jagged rocks and dust. She unstrapped herself from the seat, wincing as she moved. Her body ached, and her legs felt weak as she climbed from the wreckage of her ship. The storm had subsided, but the air was still thick with tension, as if the moon itself were holding its breath. Margot's first instinct was to check the ship systems. She pulled open the hatch and stumbled out into the rocky landscape, her boots crunching against the dust. Her ship was a wreck, but it was still intact enough that she could maybe salvage something from it. Communications were down, but she wasn't about to sit around waiting for rescue, not with Earth light years away. But then she heard it. A soft sound, barely audible above the wind. It came from the edge of the cave she had landed near, a sound that made her heart skip a beat. It was a child's cry. Margot froze, scanning the darkness. The moon had been devoid of life, no animals, no vegetation. Yet there was no mistaking the sound of a small, pained cry. She moved toward it instinctively, her hand resting on the sidearm at her belt. Every muscle in her body was on high alert. She followed the sound to a narrow crevice in the rocks, where the jagged stones split open like a dark wound. Margot approached cautiously, her breath shallow. She wasn't alone. Inside the cave, two figures huddled together. They were small, and though their skin was a strange shade of pale blue, they resembled children. A boy and a girl, both about 6 or 7 years old by human standards. They were scared, their wide eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the cave. They didn't seem to notice Margot at first. The girl, with hair that shimmered silver like stardust, clutched the boy tightly. Her skin was smooth, almost luminescent, and her small hands trembled as she rocked back and forth, murmuring in a language Margot didn't understand. The boy, darker-skinned with black eyes that gleamed with a sense of quiet intelligence, looked up at her as she stepped forward. His expression shifted from fear to something that resembled recognition. "Hello?" Margot said softly, her voice breaking the eerie silence. She took another step forward, trying to seem as non-threatening as possible. "Are you hurt?" The girl looked at her with wide, fearful eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she stared, her gaze fixed on Margot with an unsettling intensity. Margot's pulse quickened as she moved closer. The boy reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against Margot's as if searching for something, some comfort. The connection was immediate, and Margot's breath caught in her throat. His touch felt warm, almost too warm, as though there was something alive inside him. "You're not from here." The boy spoke in perfect English, his voice soft but clear. It was the first words she'd heard from him, and they made Margot pause in shock. You speak English?" Margot said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "We don't belong here." Before Margot could respond, the girl turned her head, her eyes wide and panicked, and whispered something to the boy in their alien language. The boy glanced at her, then at Margot, his expression softening. "Please," he said, his voice more urgent now. "They'll come for us." Margot's confusion deepened. She didn't know who he was talking about, but she knew one thing. These children were not human, and their situation was far more dangerous than she could understand. Without thinking, Margot scooped the boy up into her arms, and the girl followed silently, pressing close to her side. Their bodies were lighter than they should have been, and the girl's warmth, like a pulse of energy, vibrated through Margot's skin. The boy clung to her as though he'd known her forever, his small hands gripping her suit. "What are you?" Margot murmured, her heart racing as the realization dawned on her. She wasn't alone. She wasn't just stranded on a desolate moon. There was something else, something she had no way of understanding. She had found these children, these aliens. A distant rumble echoed across the moon's surface, cutting through her thoughts. It was too quiet to be natural, too foreboding. Margot didn't know who or what was coming, but she knew she had to act fast. Without another word, she turned and rushed back to the wreckage of her ship. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She had to protect them. There was no choice now. She was their only chance. Margot's heart pounded in her chest as she hurried back to the wreckage of the ship, the alien children still clinging to her. The boy, Tarek, was quiet but seemed to draw closer to her with every step. His body pressed against her like he was trying to become part of her. The girl, Ilani, was a little more hesitant, keeping her distance but always glancing up at Margot with wide, uncertain eyes. Despite the dire circumstances, Margot couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to these children than just their alien origins. They weren't just refugees, they were something else. The cave where she had found them was now behind her, the threat of whatever was out there still looming. Margot didn't know what they referred to, but she knew that staying in the open was not an option. She had to make it back to the ship, what was left of it. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only safe place she could think of. For now. The storm had calmed, but the wind still howled, carrying a strange hum in the air that Margot couldn't quite place. It seemed to vibrate with an energy she couldn't sense directly but could feel in her bones. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the storm, some alien predator or worse. But there was nothing, just the barren landscape of dust and rocks stretching out in every direction. She reached the wreckage of her ship and quickly climbed inside, carefully lowering Tarek and Ilani to the floor. The ship's interior was dimly lit, the control panels sparking intermittently, but it was still a relative haven. Margot closed the hatch behind her and leaned against it, her mind racing. There was so much she didn't understand, so many questions that seemed to be piling up faster than she could process them. She glanced at the children, who were standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. Tarek was watching her intently, his eyes following her every move. Ilani, on the other hand, had retreated a little, standing by the wall, her hands nervously tugging at the hem of her clothes. "Are you two okay?" Margot asked, her voice softer than she intended. She wasn't even sure why she asked. It felt like a hollow question in the face of everything happening, but it was the only thing she could think of. Tarek didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though considering her words. "We are not hurt," he said, his voice unusually calm for someone who had been through such an ordeal. "But we are lost." Margot's chest tightened. "Lost?" she repeated, not sure what to make of that. They weren't human, she was sure of that now. Their presence, the way they spoke, the strange power she'd glimpsed earlier, it all pointed to that. But lost could mean so many things. They could be refugees, or they could be something much more complicated. Ilani spoke up then, her voice soft but earnest. We were not supposed to be here. We came from far away. But they... She hesitated, glancing at Tarek before continuing. They found us, and we had to run. Margot felt a chill creep up her spine. They were running from someone, and whatever it was, it didn't sound good. She looked at the two of them, small, scared, and lost on a strange moon. And suddenly, the weight of their situation hit her. These children weren't just stranded, they were in danger. Who found you? Margot asked, her tone firmer now. She needed to know. Who's coming after you? Tarek's gaze turned inward, as though he were listening to something far away. We cannot say, he answered after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. Not yet. Margot bit her lip, trying to think. She wasn't sure if they were hiding something or if they were simply too terrified to speak. Either way, the feeling of unease settled deeper in her stomach. She needed to keep them safe, and that was becoming more and more difficult with each passing second. Whoever was after them was still out there, and now they were in a metal box with limited resources. She reached for her emergency supply pack, pulling out a portable scanner and running a quick diagnostic on the ship's systems. The ship's engines were damaged beyond immediate repair, but the power core was still operational, which meant she could keep the lights on and the atmosphere breathable for a while. It wasn't much, but it would do for the moment. Okay, Margot said, standing up and turning toward the children. We need to get to Earth. The sooner we can make contact, the better. I'll find a way to fix the ship, and then we'll figure out what to do next. Tarek and Alani exchanged a glance, and Margot caught the brief flicker of something in their eyes. A shared understanding. It was as though they were communicating without words. An unspoken bond between them that Margot couldn't quite grasp. You don't have to go back, Tarek said suddenly, his voice low but insistent. You can stay with us. You don't have to take us to Earth. Margot froze, a chill running through her veins. She didn't know what to make of that. They were children, but the way he said it felt almost like an offer or a command. There was something unsettling about the way they spoke, like they knew more than they were letting on. I have to take you back, Margot said, trying to keep her voice steady. It's the safest place. Earth will protect you. Alani shook her head slowly, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light. Earth won't protect us. They'll only want to use us. Her voice was calm but firm, and it was impossible for Margot to ignore the truth in those words. Margot's stomach twisted as she processed that. The implications were staggering. These children weren't just refugees, they were something more. Something that Earth, with its own interests in mind, might try to exploit. The thought made Margot's skin crawl, but she couldn't turn back now. She had already committed herself to their safety. There was no going back. What do you mean? She asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was asking out of curiosity or fear. Tarek reached out to touch her arm, his small fingers surprisingly warm against her skin. You don't know yet, he said softly. But you will. And for a fleeting moment, Margot wasn't sure if she was speaking to a child or something far older. Something that had lived far longer than her and had seen far more. The silence between them hung heavy. Margot swallowed hard, her mind racing. She couldn't deny it. There was something strange about these children. They weren't just innocent victims of circumstance. They were the key to something much bigger than herself, and she was now entangled in it. But for now, the immediate problem was survival. The ship was damaged, and their enemies, whoever they were still out there. Margot had to focus on getting them to safety. How that would happen, she had no idea. But she wasn't going to let these children fall into the hands of whatever dangers lurked on this moon, or beyond. I'll protect you, Margot said finally, her voice low but determined. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Alani's gaze softened, and Tarek smiled faintly. But Margot couldn't shake the feeling that her promise might already be doomed. The hours passed in a haze of tension. Margot sat in the cockpit of the damaged ship, her fingers flying over the controls, trying to salvage what she could from the wreckage. Every few minutes, she would glance back at Tarek and Alani, who had settled into a quiet corner of the cabin, whispering softly in their strange language. Margot didn't understand what they were saying, but she had the sense that they were far more familiar with the situation than she was, and that unsettled her. The soft hum of the ship's power core was the only sound that filled the silence. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the walls, and Margot was hyper-aware of the children's presence behind her. They seemed to sense the unease in her, and though they kept their distance, it felt like a barrier that neither side knew how to break. Tarek, ever observant, watched Margot's every move, his dark eyes never leaving her as she worked. Ilani, though quieter, would occasionally look up with a gaze that felt too knowing. Sometimes, Margot would catch her staring at the control panels, as though the girl was studying the ship's broken systems with the same level of intensity as Margot herself. It made Margot's skin prickle, despite her best efforts to keep the children safe inside the ship. Margot couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were running out of time. She had no communication systems, no way of reaching out for help, and her only option was to repair the ship enough to make it back to Earth. The idea of leaving this moon, of leaving these children to their fate, seemed unbearable. But the longer they stayed here, the more she realized how fragile their situation really was. And then there was the threat that still lingered in the back of her mind, the one that Tarek had warned her about. Whoever was coming after them, whoever they were, had to be powerful. She couldn't risk staying put much longer. The stillness of the cabin was suddenly broken by the sound of a distant rumble. Margot's breath caught in her throat as she froze, eyes darting to the small viewport. For a moment, she thought it might be another storm, but the sound grew louder, deeper, like the growl of something far more dangerous. "Something's coming," Margot muttered under her breath, pushing away from the console. She stood up, her hands trembling as she checked the external sensors. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the readings. There was no mistaking it. Something large was approaching, and it wasn't natural. It was too fast, too erratic to be a simple weather anomaly. Margot turned to face the children. They were both on their feet now, the calmness in their expressions unsettling as they watched her. "They're coming for us?" Tarek said, his voice tight, almost strained. Ilani's hand went to his arm, a subtle gesture that seemed to comfort him. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice soft but firm. Margot swallowed hard, her mind racing. "What do we do?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Tarek looked toward the viewport, his eyes narrowing. "We wait," he said simply. "And we survive." The tension in the room grew unbearable. Margot could feel her pulse pounding in her throat as she rushed to secure the ship's doors, double-checking the seal. There wasn't much she could do. If something was coming for them, they'd have to wait it out. The rumbling sound grew louder, vibrating the very walls of the ship. Margot gripped the edge of the console as she tried to steady her breathing, her mind working furiously. The ship was nowhere near capable of flight. She couldn't outrun whatever was approaching, and there were no escape pods. Tarek's voice broke through her thoughts again, and she turned to face him. "You must not leave the ship," he said, his tone gravely serious. "Whatever comes, do not go outside." Margot's gaze hardened. "And if they come inside? We will protect you," Ilani said quietly. But there was a weight in her words that Margot couldn't ignore. She didn't know what it meant, but she could sense that it wasn't a hollow promise. The ship groaned as the rumbling sound grew even closer. The air in the cabin felt thick, as if the pressure outside was building. Margot could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the subtle hum of the ship's power core beneath her feet. Everything was on the edge of something. Her hands were clammy as she reached for the ship's weapons cache, hidden under the floor panel. She'd only used them in training simulations, but now they felt like her only option. Her breath hitched as she pulled out a small blaster, checking it quickly before slotting it into her holster. "Stay close to me," Margot ordered. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but it felt necessary. There was no time for doubt now. The children didn't respond, but they moved closer to her, standing with an eerie calm. Tarek's eyes were no longer wide with fear. Instead, they were focused, sharp, like a soldier preparing for battle. Ilani's hand remained on Tarek's arm, her silver hair falling around her shoulders like liquid light. Margot could feel the weight of their gaze, could feel their energy building in the small space. It was a strange sensation, like they were both too still and too alive at the same time. It was as if they were waiting for something. And then it happened. The ship lurched violently, the ground shaking beneath her feet. Margot barely had time to brace herself before the alarms blared to life, flashing red in the dim cabin. The tremors didn't stop, growing in intensity until the entire ship seemed to be buckling under the force. Margot's breath quickened, and she held on to the edge of the console as the shaking worsened. The ship's hull groaned again, louder this time, and there was a deafening crack as something impacted the surface. It sounded like a heavy blow, like a giant fist slamming into the ship. The alarms blared even louder, and Margot felt a sense of rising panic in her chest. Tarek and Alani didn't flinch. Instead, they stepped toward her, moving with a slow, deliberate pace, as though they were fully prepared for whatever was happening outside. Margot couldn't decide whether that calmed her or made her more uneasy. "What's happening?" Margot shouted over the noise, her voice barely audible above the cacophony. "We are not alone," Tarek said simply, his voice steady and calm, as though he had known this would happen all along. Margot's stomach dropped as she realized what that meant. Whoever had been coming for them was finally here. The next impact was closer, and Margot heard a sound unlike anything she had ever heard before, like a deep growl, reverberating through the ship's hull. It was so powerful, so primal, that it sent a chill down her spine. And then the lights flickered out completely, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, hanging in the air like a thick fog. And then, in the distance, Margot heard it. A faint whisper of movement. Something or someone was outside. Something was coming. Margot's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't over. The real danger was just beginning. The darkness in the ship was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lights flickering intermittently. Margot's breath quickened as the weight of the silence pressed down on her. The tremors had stopped, but the unease in the air was palpable. She stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The ship had been hit, and now something was outside, circling, watching, waiting. Her hand instinctively moved toward the weapon at her side, the cold metal of the blaster sending a shock of reassurance through her. She could feel the pulse of the power core beneath her feet, its humming vibrations the only indication that the ship wasn't entirely offline. But that wasn't what scared her. What scared her was what she couldn't see or hear. Whatever was lurking outside, or whoever was coming for the children. Tarek and Alani remained eerily still in the corner, their dark eyes reflecting the dim, unstable lights. They didn't seem to be afraid. In fact, they seemed almost resigned, like they had been through this before. Their calmness only served to deepen the gnawing discomfort growing in Margot's chest. She wasn't sure if it was their silence or the fear that still clung to her own thoughts, but something in their demeanor made her question everything. These children, who had claimed to be running from something, didn't seem like helpless victims. They seemed prepared. "What's out there?" Margot asked, her voice tight with uncertainty. Alani didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to Margot's side, her bare feet silent on the floor. Her silver hair shimmered even in the dim light, and her eyes seemed to have an otherworldly depth to them. Margot watched as the girl peered into the darkness, as if she could see something that Margot couldn't. "They're not here to rescue us," Alani said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Margot's stomach twisted. Who's coming?" Alani hesitated before speaking again. "The Zara. They seek what is ours." Margot's heart skipped a beat. The Zara. She'd heard the name before, during her brief training before leaving Earth. The Zara were an advanced alien race, known for their ruthlessness and territorial nature. They had conquered and enslaved many other species over the centuries, leaving devastation in their wake. But that was all she knew. Nothing concrete. Just whispers and rumors. "How do you know this?" Margot asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. Alani turned to face her, her gaze intense. "We are not what you think we are," she said quietly. We are not just children. We were born to lead, to guide. But the Zara, they want to control us. Margot's thoughts raced. The idea of the Zara targeting these children for their leadership, her mind struggled to wrap around the idea. She had seen them as innocents, just victims caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now she wasn't so sure. Tarek, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. You don't understand, he said in a voice much older than his years. We are part of something much bigger. A war, a battle for our people's survival. We are the key, and the Zara will stop at nothing to claim us. Margot stared at him, trying to reconcile the innocence she had seen in these children with the grave weight of their words. There was no doubt in her mind now. These children were hiding something, but they weren't lying either. Everything about them screamed that they were more than they appeared, and the world they had come from was far darker than she had imagined. The rumble of the ship's hull shook her from her thoughts. She turned quickly toward the viewport, her eyes scanning the barren landscape outside. The ground was still, but she could feel the tension in the air, the sense of being hunted. How do we stop them? Margot asked, her voice low and urgent. There was no way she was going to let these children fall into the hands of the Zara. Not after everything they had been through. Alani shook her head. There is no stopping them. Not without help. Her voice quivered slightly, though she quickly masked it with a cool expression. We are not safe here. They have already found us. Margot's mind raced. She had to act. She couldn't afford to let the Zara capture these children. Not when they were the key to something much larger. Something beyond Earth's comprehension. She needed to get them out, get them to safety, before whatever was hunting them found a way inside the ship. Can we fight back? Margot asked, her fingers tightening around the blaster at her side. Tarek shook his head. Not like this. Not without the right power. The words echoed in Margot's mind, lingering like a curse. What do you mean, the right power? She demanded. What power do you need? Tarek's eyes flicked toward Alani, who gave him a silent nod. He turned back to Margot, his expression almost unreadable. We need the stone, he said softly. It's the only way to stop the Zara. Margot frowned. The stone? What stone? Alani spoke up then, her voice cold and distant. It is our birthright, a symbol of our power. Without it, we are nothing. The words hit Margot like a blow. The stone? What could a stone possibly have to do with all of this? But the way the children spoke, the weight of their words, it was clear that they weren't talking about just any artifact. This stone was essential to their survival, and to the survival of their people. So, we need to find the stone to have any chance against the Zara? Margot asked, her voice shaky with the realization of how far this had all gone. Tarek nodded. It is hidden. Far from here. Where? Margot asked. Where do we go? Alani turned her gaze toward the viewport again, her eyes scanning the horizon. It's on our home world. But it's not just a matter of finding it. It's a matter of surviving long enough to get to it. Margot felt a pang in her chest as the weight of the situation finally began to settle on her. This wasn't just about getting back to Earth. This wasn't just about helping two alien children escape danger. This was about something much bigger. Something she wasn't ready for, but that she had already become entangled in. We're not just running from the Zara, Alani continued, her voice shaking slightly now. They won't stop until they have us. They'll tear through everything in their path to get to us. Margot stared at her, the gravity of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the beginning of something much larger. Something that could shape the future of not just the children, but entire civilizations. She had no idea how to handle this, how to protect them. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let them fall into the hands of the Zara. Then we go, Margot said, her voice a mix of resolve and uncertainty. We find the stone, and we stop them. The ship lurched again, a sharp sound cutting through the silence. Margot's heart leapt into her throat. The Zara were already here, and now there was no turning back. The tension inside the ship was suffocating. Every movement Margot made seemed to echo in the silence. Her fingers gripped the control panel so tightly her knuckles ached. But she couldn't afford to show any sign of weakness. They were being hunted. And the truth of it settled like a weight on her chest. The Zara were close. She could feel it. Whatever had happened to the ship, whatever was out there, had made it clear that they were no longer in control of their fate. But now, there was no time for second-guessing. There was only survival. "Where do we go from here?" Margot asked, her voice rough. She kept her eyes focused on the viewport, but it was hard to discern anything in the darkness beyond the flashing emergency lights. Tarek, ever calm, stood by her side, watching the stars pass by like indifferent witnesses. His hands were clasped behind his back, and though he was a child by any human measure, he carried himself like a soldier, a warrior. His demeanor was unsettling, as though he had already accepted his fate and wasn't afraid of whatever came next. "We go to the place of the stone," Tarek replied, his tone low but firm. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "But we cannot do it alone. We will need allies." Margot's heart sank as she tried to absorb the magnitude of what he was saying. Allies? Who could possibly help them now? The Zara weren't a force you simply walked away from. If they were coming for the children, there was no one who could stop them. Not without resources, not without a plan. The military back home might have the firepower, but Earth's government would never buy into the idea of a war between alien factions. They had always kept their distance, too consumed with their own politics to care about anything outside their borders. And now, Margot realized, she was tangled up in something far beyond her comprehension. "You think anyone would help us?" Margot asked, her voice full of disbelief. "There's no way to make anyone believe what's really going on." Tarek turned his eyes to her, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to convince everyone, just the right ones." Margot swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't know how they could find the right people, especially when they couldn't even communicate with Earth. The communications relay was down. Her best option was to make it to the stone, but that path was fraught with danger. Every part of her wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but now was not the time. The ship was on its last legs. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for a miracle. A sudden, high-pitched beep from the control panel snapped her out of her thoughts. Margot immediately looked down at the screen. The sensors were picking up something moving on the surface below. Something large. The readings were erratic but unmistakable. The Zara had arrived. "We have to move," Margot said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." She turned toward the back of the ship, her footsteps echoing in the cabin. Alani was already standing, her expression tense, her hands clasped at her sides. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, prepared for whatever was coming next. "Do you have a plan?" Margot asked, though part of her already knew the answer. She couldn't help but wonder if the children had known all along that this would happen, that they had been leading her down a path she didn't understand. Alani met her gaze, her silver eyes gleaming with an unreadable intensity. "We must leave before they find us," she said softly. "There is no time for hesitation." Margot nodded grimly. She was beginning to understand that the children had been trained for moments like this, that they were not as helpless as they appeared. But that knowledge only unsettled her more. The last thing she wanted was to rely on children, especially ones who seemed to possess a power she couldn't begin to fathom. "We leave in 10 minutes, Margot said, moving quickly to the main hatch. "I'll get the engines running. We can't stay here any longer." Tarek stepped forward, stopping her before she could reach the console. "It's too late for that," he said quietly. His voice was softer than she expected, but the weight of his words hit her like a punch. "The Zara are already here." Margot froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, time itself holding its breath. She didn't know what to say, how to react. She wanted to argue, to tell him that she could still make it, that they could fight their way out of this, but the way he looked at her made her pause. He wasn't just warning her. He was preparing her for something she wasn't ready to face. The ship shook again, this time with greater force. The walls groaned as something powerful hit them from the outside. The emergency lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the room. It wasn't just a rumble. It was a clear, deliberate assault. "Brace for impact," Margot shouted, but it was too late. The shockwave hit them with brutal force. The ship bucked violently, throwing Margot off her feet and slamming her into the side panel. The blaster flew from her holster, clattering across the floor as the cabin filled with the deafening sound of metal scraping against metal. For a brief moment, everything went dark. Margot groaned, trying to push herself up, her head spinning. She could hear Tarek's voice, faint through the haze of her dizziness. "We need to leave the ship. Now." She opened her eyes to see the children standing by the exit hatch, already prepared to move. Delaney's face was pale, but her eyes were still sharp with determination. Tarek was standing rigid, as though every muscle in his body was on alert, ready to move. Margot's heart raced. The ship was in no condition to fly, not with the damage it had sustained. It was only a matter of time before whatever was outside forced their hand. She had no choice. They couldn't stay here. They had to leave even if they didn't know where they were going. "Get to the escape pod," Margot ordered, her voice rough. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous." Alani nodded immediately, her movements precise, like a soldier following orders. But Tarek hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the viewport. Margot followed his stare, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A shadow, large and shifting, loomed over the ship. It was hard to make out the details, but it was unmistakable. Something enormous, powerful, and ominous, moving in the darkness of the planet's surface. It wasn't just the Zara. There was something else, something far worse. Tarek's voice was almost a whisper. "It's them. The ones who guard the stone." Margot's stomach turned. If this was what was waiting for them, they had no chance of escaping. But she couldn't let the children see her fear. She couldn't afford to lose control. "Now!" Margot shouted. "Get to the escape pod." Tarek and Alani didn't hesitate. They were already moving, already at the door, with Margot close behind. As they ran toward the exit, the last thought that crossed her mind was how little time they had, and how much was riding on the decision to leave everything they had known behind. With a final glance back at the ship, Margot stepped into the unknown. The escape pod jostled violently as it descended toward the surface, a low hum vibrating through the hull as Margot gripped the controls, trying desperately to stabilize the craft. The wind outside howled, a constant reminder of the hostile planet below. She glanced over at the children, who sat together in the back, their faces unreadable. Tarek was staring out the small viewport, his eyes narrowed in concentration, while Alani had her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her silver hair falling over her shoulders like a curtain of silk. Despite the chaos around them, they seemed unaffected, almost serene. Margot's mind raced as she steered the pod toward the planet's surface. The Zara were coming, but it wasn't just them she had to worry about now. There was something else lurking in the shadows, something far darker, something that had been waiting for them. She could feel it, deep in her bones. The children's cryptic words from earlier, "the ones who guard the stone," echoed in her mind, adding to the weight pressing on her chest. She had no idea what kind of enemies they were about to face, but whatever it wasn't going to be easy. The ship lurched again, throwing Margot forward in her seat, and she cursed under her breath, quickly regaining control. She could feel the heat of the atmosphere pressing against the pod, the craft vibrating as it cut through the air at breakneck speed. There was no time to be careful. They had to land, and they had to land now. "Hold on," Margot muttered, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were slick with sweat, and her heart was hammering in her chest. The pod began to shake violently, the sounds of metal straining against the force of entry deafening. Alani looked up, her gaze meeting Margot's with an unsettling calmness. "We must land quickly," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the descent. "They are coming." Margot swallowed hard, trying to force her panic into something more manageable. They were close now, the ground rushing up to meet them, the gravity of the situation settling over her like a dark cloud. She could see the rough terrain below, a barren wasteland of cracked rock and dust. It was not the kind of place anyone would want to crash, but it would have to do. The pod hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, sending a shockwave through the hull. Margot's head slammed into the control panel, and she bit back a curse, her vision swimming for a moment. The pod was still intact, but it had taken a heavy hit. "Everyone out!" she shouted, pulling herself upright and grabbing the emergency hatch release. The pod had landed in a valley, surrounded by jagged rocks that rose like sentinels in the distance. There was no time to waste. Tarek was already moving, his small form darting toward the exit, while Alani followed more slowly, her gaze scanning the horizon with the kind of awareness Margot had come to expect from her. There was no hesitation in their movements, no fear. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what was coming. Margot joined them quickly, her hand resting on the blaster at her side. She scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the empty landscape stretching out in every direction. But she knew that wasn't a good sign. Silence was never a good sign. The moment they stepped outside, the air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping noticeably as though the planet itself was reacting to their presence. Margot felt a shiver run down her spine. She had no idea what they were about to face, but the children's quiet confidence didn't exactly reassure her. They were different. They weren't afraid. But Margot was beginning to wonder if that was because they had seen far worse than anything she could imagine. "Where do we go?" Margot asked, her voice low but urgent. She couldn't afford to waste time. Ilani glanced up at the jagged peaks in the distance, her eyes narrowing. "The stone is hidden beyond the ridge," she said, her voice steady. "But we must move quickly." Margot didn't need to ask why. She had a feeling that whatever was coming for them wouldn't wait for them to make up their minds. She led the way, keeping her eyes trained on the horizon as they moved across the uneven terrain, the rocky ground crunching beneath their boots. The farther they traveled, the more Margot felt like they were being watched. It wasn't just a feeling. It was something tangible, something pressing in on her from all sides. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy. She could almost hear the hum of something just beyond her reach, like a distant pulse. She wasn't sure if it was the planet itself or something else entirely, but it made her skin crawl. Tarek kept pace beside her, his eyes darting from side to side as if searching for something. He hadn't spoken since they left the pod, but Margot could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as though he were bracing for impact. Ilani, on the other hand, walked with an eerie calmness, as if the very planet itself was an extension of her own thoughts. They walked for what felt like hours, the sun of the distant star casting long, stretching shadows across the barren landscape. The silence was suffocating. Margot could hear the sound of her own breath, the thud of her heart in her chest. But there was no other noise, no rustling of creatures, no breeze. It was as though the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then suddenly Margot froze. A shadow passed over them, moving faster than the eye could track. It wasn't a bird or an insect. It was something larger, something with purpose. Tarek's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "They are here," he said, his voice low but steady. "We must hurry." Margot didn't need further urging. She turned and sprinted toward the ridge, her heart pounding in her chest. The children followed closely behind her, their movements swift and sure, as if they knew exactly where they were going. As they neared the ridge, Margot spotted something in the distance, a faint outline against the horizon. It looked like a structure, something old, crumbling under the weight of time. But what caught her attention was the strange energy that seemed to radiate from it, pulsing in rhythmic waves. That was it, the stone. But as she took a step forward, she felt it. A cold, suffocating pressure in the air. A low, guttural growl echoed across the valley, reverberating through the rocks. Margot whipped her head around, her eyes widening as she saw movement in the distance, shadows shifting and twisting as they approached. Tarek and Ilani were already moving toward the structure, not even glancing back. Margot didn't hesitate. She followed them, her feet pounding against the rocky ground as the air seemed to thicken around her. But the shadows were closing in, and whatever was coming for them would not stop until they had what they wanted. Margot pushed herself harder, faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the energy of the stone seemed to pulse ever louder. They weren't alone anymore, and this was only the beginning. The ground trembled beneath Margot's boots as she sprinted toward the stone. Every step felt heavier, each breath sharper, more urgent. The shadows closing in behind her weren't just a threat. They were alive, pulsing with an energy that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She could hear the faint growl growing louder, reverberating across the barren landscape. It wasn't the Zara. It was something far more ancient, something born from the depths of the planet itself. Tarek and Alani were ahead of her now, their forms silhouetted against the dimming sky. They moved with purpose, undistracted, as though the oncoming storm didn't touch them. They were driven, focused on reaching the stone, whatever that was. Margot's pulse pounded in her ears as she quickened her pace. She wasn't sure what awaited them at the structure. An ancient temple, a relic of forgotten times. But it had to be their only hope. Whatever it was connected to the children. The stone called to them, like a magnet, its energy pulsing through the air, inviting them closer. She could almost feel it too. The landscape around them had shifted subtly as they neared the ridge. Jagged rocks were replaced by a strange, smooth surface, as if the earth itself had been carved away by unseen hands. In the distance, the stone loomed, a towering obelisk of blackened stone, streaked with veins of glowing blue light. It looked as though it had been pulled from the heart of the planet itself, its presence imposing, almost oppressive. Margot stumbled over a rock and caught herself, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The growl from behind was louder now, closer. She risked a glance over her shoulder, but all she saw was a blur of movement, too fast to track. "Move!" she yelled to the children, though they didn't need her prompting. Tarek was already reaching the stone, his hand outstretched toward it. Alani followed closely, her face unreadable as she joined him. They stopped just a few feet from the structure, waiting, watching. Margot's chest tightened with anxiety as she approached. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with a strange energy, vibrating through her body as though the very earth was alive. There was no time to question it, no time to second-guess her instincts. She had to trust the children, trust that this was the right place, even if she didn't understand why. The shadows behind them were closer now, too close. Margot could hear their claws scraping across the rocky ground, their heavy breathing reverberating through the air. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached the stone. Tarek turned toward her as she approached. There was no fear in his eyes, no doubt. He looked as if he had been here before, as if he had been expecting this moment. "The stone will protect us," he said, his voice steady and calm, though Margot could sense the urgency beneath the words. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time with more force, a deep, resonating rumble that shook her to her core. Margot looked up just in time to see the shadows, twisted, alien shapes, rushing toward them, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They were not human, that much was clear. Their bodies were elongated, their limbs too long, their movements unnatural. But what chilled Margot most was the force they carried with them, the palpable sense of malice that radiated from them in waves. Without warning, the creatures charged. Margot's instincts kicked in. She reached for her blaster, but before she could draw it, Tarek raised his hand. A flash of light erupted from his fingertips, a crackling bolt of energy that shot toward the approaching creatures. The force of it was enough to send them stumbling back, their screeches echoing across the landscape. Alani stepped forward, her eyes glowing faintly, a soft hum emanating from her as she raised her hands in the air. The stone responded, its blue veins pulsing brighter, and the ground beneath their feet cracked open, a massive energy barrier rising from the earth. The creatures howled in fury, slamming into the invisible shield with all their strength, but it held firm, keeping them at bay. Margot's breath caught in her throat as she watched, stunned. The children weren't just fleeing, they were controlling the stone, bending its power to protect them. They were far more than just survivors. They were its heirs, its protectors. What are they? Margot whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. They are the guardians of the stone, Alani said quietly. Her gaze focused on the creatures as they struggled against the barrier. And they will not stop until we are either dead or gone. Margot's pulse quickened. The creatures were relentless, but for now they were trapped outside the barrier. For how long, though? She didn't know. Tarek's eyes narrowed, his expression determined. We must activate the stone. Only then can we stop them. Margot glanced at the glowing obelisk. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were alive and aware of their presence. But how could they activate it? She had no idea. She wasn't like them. She didn't have the power to wield it. She had barely understood what was happening when they arrived. Tarek took a step forward, his hand hovering just inches from the surface of the stone. The air around him crackled with energy, and Margot could feel the intensity of it, like a storm on the edge of breaking. She watched as Tarek closed his eyes, his lips moving in a language she couldn't understand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the stone's veins of blue light flared, and a pulse of energy surged outward, sending a shockwave through the air. The creatures screeched again, but this time, the sound was filled with pain, a high-pitched wail that made Margot's ears ring. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and the energy barrier began to shift. The creatures were being pushed back, their bodies dissolving into the air like smoke, until nothing remained. Margot stared at the stone, her mind reeling. Had they won? Were the creatures gone? Tarek lowered his hand, his eyes flickering with something like exhaustion. For now, but they will return. And when they do, we must be ready. Margot nodded, though she didn't feel ready. How could they be? She was still trying to understand everything that was happening. But one thing was clear. The children were the key to everything. The stone, the creatures, the entire planet, it was all connected to them. We need to move, Alani said, breaking her out of her thoughts. This is only temporary. The Guardians will regroup, and we will not have much time. Margot glanced around, realizing that the momentary victory had given them only a brief respite. The stone might have protected them for now, but it wouldn't hold forever. They had to find answers, and fast. What was the stone? What was its purpose? And what did the children have to do with it? As the three of them stood there, surrounded by the glowing obelisk, Margot felt a sense of urgency rising within her. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The wind had picked up again, sweeping across the rocky plains with a howling force that left Margot's skin chilled and raw. She stood at the base of the stone, the blue veins of energy pulsing with an otherworldly glow. The atmosphere around them hummed, vibrating under the immense power contained within the obelisk. She could feel it, this strange, ancient force that seemed to resonate with something deep inside her. But it was more than just the stone. It was the children. Tarek and Alani were tethered to it, as if they were one with the planet itself. And that connection made Margot's skin prickle with both awe and fear. We need to leave, Tarek said, his voice steady, though Margot could see the strain in his eyes. He was exhausted, his young face pale and drawn from the effort. The power it took to control the stone, to fight off the Guardians, was no small feat. Where are we going? Margot asked, feeling the weight of the question settle like a stone in her chest. You said we needed to activate the stone. What does that mean? How are we supposed to stop what's coming? Alani turned to face her, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light. The stone must be taken to the heart of the divide, she said, her voice low, almost as though speaking the words took more energy than she had left. Only there can its true power be unlocked. Only there will we be able to stop the Guardians once and for all. The heart of the divide? Margot repeated, her brow furrowing. Where is that? Beyond the veil, Alani answered, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though she could already see it. Past the place where the planet splits, the place where the old empire fell. Margot's mind raced. The old empire? She had heard rumors, whispers from the few people who dared to study the ancient civilizations of this world, but nothing concrete. No one knew exactly what had happened here, why the Zara were so desperate to control this planet, or what the stone represented. The children clearly knew, but they weren't offering her enough to go on. What exactly is the stone? Margot pressed, her voice coming out more desperate than she meant it to. She had no choice but to trust them. Tarek and Alani had powers she couldn't explain, and that energy barrier had saved them. But it still didn't make sense. Alani's gaze softened, but she didn't answer right away. Tarek spoke for her, his voice quieter than it had been, as though he were choosing his words carefully. The stone is the key to our people's survival, he said. Without it, the divide will remain open, and the Empire will never be united. If the Guardians find it, if they control it, they will use its power to enslave the worlds. Margot swallowed hard. And you, your royal lineage? What does that have to do with it? Tarek looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with a somber intensity. My sister and I, we are the last of the royal line. The stone was meant to be ours to protect, to guide. But the Empire fell into chaos. Our ancestors failed and the Guardians rose up. They are the remnants of an old order, a dangerous order that seeks to harness the stone's power. Margot was beginning to understand the stakes, but it wasn't enough. She could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on her. The lives of these two children tied to something far larger than any of them could control. If the Guardians succeeded, if the Zara reached the stone before they did, the thought was too terrifying to fully grasp. We can't stay here, Alani said, her voice hardening as she looked to the horizon, sensing something Margot couldn't. The Guardians will regroup, and we'll have no chance to reach the Veil if we're caught out in the open. Tarek nodded. We need to move now. They'll be coming for us. Margot clenched her jaw. They didn't have a plan, not really. They had the stone and they had the children, but that was it. They had no way of knowing what kind of dangers lay ahead. No way of predicting the Guardians' next move. Then let's go, Margot said, her voice firm, though she could feel the edge of panic creeping in. Where is the Veil? Alani looked toward the jagged cliffs in the distance. Beyond them, the land seemed to fold into itself, an impossible crevasse that split the planet like a wound. We must cross the divide, she said. It is not a place for the faint of heart. Margot didn't respond. She didn't have the luxury of hesitation. The Guardians were out there, and every second they wasted was another step closer to being caught. We can't waste time, Margot said, her voice tight with resolve. Lead the way. The children moved ahead without a word, their pace steady but unhurried, as though they were more than capable of navigating this alien landscape on their own. Margot followed them, her senses heightened, her hands still resting on the blaster at her side. The silence around them was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of the earth shifting beneath their feet. The stone they had come from seemed to pulse with a strange, rhythmic beat, as if the planet itself was alive and aware of their movements. They moved for hours, climbing over the rocky terrain, until the jagged cliffs loomed over them, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was here that the landscape began to change, the once barren land transforming into something far more menacing. The divide, Margot realized, was more than just a physical rift in the planet. It was a scar, a mark left by some ancient, destructive force. The air grew colder as they moved closer, and the ground beneath their feet became unstable, cracking and shifting with each step. The divide was a chasm, a vast, gaping wound in the planet's surface that stretched as far as Margot could see. It seemed endless, a jagged scar that tore through the land like a wound that refused to heal. The children were already moving toward the edge, their steps sure and certain. Margot hesitated, feeling the pull of the darkness ahead. She wasn't sure what lay beyond the divide, but she knew one thing for certain. The Guardians would stop at nothing to get the stone, and they wouldn't hesitate to use every weapon at their disposal to do so. Alani stopped at the edge of the chasm, her gaze fixed on the far side. We are close, she said, her voice a whisper in the wind. The stone's true power will awaken there. Margot glanced at Tarek, who nodded solemnly. He seemed to know more than he was saying, but Margot didn't have time to press him further. The Guardians were already on their trail, and they didn't have the luxury of waiting. They would have to cross the divide. The chasm before them was nothing short of a nightmare. The divide stretched out like a gaping wound in the earth, an abyss that seemed to swallow the light. The air grew even colder as they approached the edge, a biting chill that made Margot's teeth rattle. Her breath misted in front of her, disappearing into the void. The edge of the rift was jagged, sharp, and unyielding, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of foreboding as they stepped closer. Tarek and Alani moved with the confidence of those who had known this place their entire lives, as if the very ground beneath their feet was a familiar, trusted companion. Margot followed, her boots slipping slightly on the loose gravel, but she kept her focus, unwilling to be distracted by the unease gnawing at her. Alani turned back toward her, her eyes glowing softly in the dimming light. "We cross here," she said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She extended her hand, and though it was an invitation, it felt more like a command. Margot hesitated for a moment, her mind swirling with doubts. How could they cross such a vast chasm? The distance was impossible, and the drop, it seemed endless. Yet, looking at the children, she saw no hesitation in their eyes. They had something she didn't, a connection to the planet, to the stone, that gave them a kind of confidence she couldn't begin to comprehend. "I'll be right behind you," Margot said, her voice tight, though she wasn't sure if it was for their sake or her own. She reached for the rope coiled at her side, preparing herself for what was to come. But before she could take another step, a sound tore through the air, a roar that reverberated from the depths of the divide, low and menacing. Margot froze, her pulse racing as the ground trembled beneath her. The Guardians were here. They had found them. "Move!" Tarek shouted, and without another word, he stepped toward the edge. But it wasn't a jump. Instead, he moved with a kind of grace that seemed unnatural, his body floating above the ground, as if gravity itself had lost its hold on him. Alani followed suit, her movements just as fluid and effortless. Margot watched, eyes wide, heart pounding in her chest. They weren't walking, they were flying. The realization hit her like a wave, and she felt the world tilt beneath her. She had never seen anything like this before. How were they doing this? Was this what the stone had given them? Or was it something more? Her legs felt like lead as she took a tentative step forward. She couldn't stay behind. Not with the Guardians closing in. Not with the chasm between her and the children. With a deep breath, she followed, feeling the strange weightlessness spread through her limbs as she crossed the divide, the air bending and twisting around her as she moved. For a moment, it felt like she was suspended between two worlds. Below her, the chasm stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing everything. Above her, the sky was beginning to darken, and she could see the faint outlines of the Guardians below, their eyes glinting in the dim light as they climbed the jagged walls of the divide in pursuit. "Keep going," Tarek shouted, his voice breaking through the disorienting silence of the divide. He was ahead of her now, his body floating effortlessly, as if the air itself was a part of him. Alani was just behind him, her eyes focused ahead. She wasn't looking back at Margot, but Margot could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the awareness of the Guardian's approach. They had to make it to the other side. They had to reach the heart of the divide. Margot's breath hitched in her chest as she pushed herself forward, her heart racing. She could feel the coldness of the air seeping through her skin, her body trembling in the weightlessness. The energy of the stone was growing stronger with each passing second, surging through the air, building to a crescendo as they neared the far side of the divide. The Guardians were closing in. Margot could hear them now, their voices guttural and unintelligible, a discordant chorus that sent a chill down her spine. They were almost upon them. "Just a little farther," Alani called out. Margot pushed herself harder, feeling the ground beneath her feet shift with the intensity of the pull. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening with each step. The Guardians were almost there, and the closer they got to the edge, the more Margot could feel the pressure building, the air thick with an electric charge. Finally, just as Margot felt she could take no more, they reached the edge. Tarek and Alani landed on solid ground with the same unnatural grace, their feet touching the surface with barely a sound. Margot followed, her feet hitting the ground with a jarring thud. She stumbled, but Alani was there, catching her arm, steadying her. "It's not over," Tarek said, his voice low, filled with a gravity that sent a shiver through Margot. Margot looked up. They were in a place like no other. An ancient structure rose before them, its stone walls weathered by time, its shape unlike anything Margot had seen before. The air here was different, thick with the weight of history, charged with the energy that had been building since they'd entered the divide. The heart of the divide, as Alani had called it, was a place of power, a place where the stone could finally be activated. But even as they stood before it, Margot could feel the pulse of the guardians behind them. Relentless, unforgiving. They would stop at nothing to take the stone, to claim it for themselves. And Margot knew that whatever happened next, they were about to face the greatest battle of their lives. "We have to unlock the stone's power now," Alani said, stepping forward, her eyes fixed on the structure before them. "Before they catch us." Margot's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder. The guardians were nearly upon them. Their forms were just visible in the distance, dark silhouettes against the dimming sky. Tarek turned to Margot, his expression determined. "You have to trust us," he said. "This is the only way." Margot swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was to come, but she had no choice. The fate of the children, of the stone, and of the entire world depended on what they did next. With a deep breath, Margot stepped forward, following the children into the heart of the divide.